there's a question that has quietly unsettled scholars and curious minds since the dawn of mankind. What if the most powerful artifacts of antiquity were never made of ordinary clay, stone, or bronze, but of another category entirely, described by the ancients as living, radiant instruments of cosmic authority, because hidden within the oldest verses of Sumerian culture lies a catalogue of phantom relics from a bygone era, sacred objects that no archaeologist can lift from the soil and for which no hard evidence was left behind, at least not directly, and yet they were pointed to again and again, believed to govern the very architecture of time, space, and human fate throughout a span of human history that saw the first true empires of the world rise and fall. That idea sits in a strange and uncomfortable place in the ancient texts. Not quite mythology, not quite history, but something far harder to categorize than either of those things alone. Ask various scholars this question, and their interpretations will diverge in surprising ways. Some treat these objects as pure poetic invention, the natural result of a pre-literate mind reaching for language grand enough to describe the cosmos. Others think the texts are pointing at something real, something that deserves far more serious attention than it typically receives. And somehow, the position that questions all conventional interpretation is more defensible than you might expect. So settle in and get comfortable, because what we're going to move through tonight isn't quite mythology, and it isn't quite conspiracy either. It's a genuine, well-documented question about what higher information the oldest civilizations on Earth actually believed they possessed, and how they used it. Now, most people who've encountered Mesopotamia at all think first of the physical record, the clay tablets stacked in museum vaults, the stone reliefs carved with winged figures, the cylinder seals pressed into soft clay by hands that lived over 4,000 years ago. And that physical record is extraordinary on its own terms. Roughly 500,000 cuneiform tablets have been recovered from the soil of ancient Iraq, though only a small fraction of them have been translated. Around an estimated 10% that have been adequately studied. You heard that right. Only 10%. And what those translated texts describe is already strange enough to hold anyone's attention. But beyond the administrative lists, the royal chronicles, and the creation hymns resting under climate-controlled glass, there exists a secondary category of Mesopotamian artifact. One that left no physical fossil in the ground, one that no excavation team will ever unearth. These are the relics that defy reality. Objects described in royal hymns, epic poems, and ancient texts as tangible and operative instruments of cosmic order. They weren't treated as metaphors by the people who wrote about them. They weren't described as symbols or allegories or poetic abstractions. They were spoken of as very real physical items, held in the very hands of the Anunnaki gods themselves, worn upon divine chests, anchored deep within the foundations of the universe, and actively radiating an immeasurable power that dictated the rise and fall of entire civilizations. That's a remarkable claim to find embedded into the oldest written literature in human history, and it deserves to be taken seriously, even if the answers remain genuinely uncertain. The word Anunna in the ancient tongue functioned as a collective designation, something closer to the Great Ones or the assembled powers. These were the primary deities of the Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian pantheons, as well as even later traditions where their figures are distorted, extrapolated, and altered to fit the political agendas of empires and kingdoms who had long since forgotten what came before. An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess, were considered their direct primordial source, and from them came Enlil, the god of air and wind, who first created space for things to exist and breathed air into the world. He stood as their chief authority on earth. Then there was Enki, the god of water and wisdom, Inanna, also known as Ishtar, who governed love and war, Utu, the sun god who administered justice, while Nanna ruled the cycles of the moon, and a dozen or so others. Together they formed a divine assembly, a cosmic government, and the texts describe that government as operating through specific instruments of power, not through vague intention or invisible will, but through literal objects. Concrete, named objects that were described in detail and performed precise functions in maintaining the order of not just the earth, but the universe as a whole. The historical records suggest these weren't conceived as decorative embellishments or merely symbolic representations. The ancient priests and scribes who wrote those words documented them with the tone of archivists recording established fact, not imaginative speculation. This is where the real question begins. Were these objects purely mythological inventions created to give shape to natural forces that early humans couldn't otherwise explain? Or did they represent something else? A distorted memory of an older understanding of the world, encoded in divine imagery, because there simply was no other available language for it? That question doesn't have a clean answer, but tracing it through the ancient texts reveals a level of specificity and consistency that's genuinely difficult to dismiss as pure speculation. Because when the same objects appear again and again across centuries of writing, described in similar terms by different scribes in different cities, that kind of consistency tends to mean something, even when we're not entirely sure what. If you're listening to this in the quiet hours of the night, let us know where and when you're joining us from in the comments section below. There's something quietly comforting about knowing that listeners scattered across distant places and different time zones are all settling into the same slow journey through the forgotten echoes of human history. And if you find this kind of history for sleep narrative interesting, consider subscribing to the channel, or join the Legends of the Dawn membership for longer, uninterrupted narratives just like this one. It helps support our efforts to keep bringing you these ancient stories each week, and continue reaching others who are searching for the same calm place to relax and unwind. So as your eyes grow heavy, let the present begin to dissolve, like an image frayed, softening at the edges, drifting back to a land that history itself has forgotten, past the familiar skylines of all that we recognize, past the printed page and the recorded word, past Babylon and its hanging gardens, past the city of Akkad and the empire that briefly united all of Mesopotamia under one crown, past even Uruk, the great walled city that may have been the first true urban center the world ever produced, back through the earliest reigns of the antediluvian kings, those legendary rulers whose reigns appear in the Sumerian king list, measured in thousands of years, back before the first breath of mortal civilization had been drawn. What we arrive at is not a place you can visit, but the ancient texts describe it with a consistency that feels almost architectural. It is a high assembly hall, somewhere before the beginning of the world as human beings know it, a gathering of the great powers, seated and deliberate, working out the terms under which reality will be organized. And at the center of that assembly, resting on what the hymns describe as a pedestal of celestial light, sits the supreme master key of universal destiny, an object of such concentrated authority that whoever holds it holds the driving mechanism of the cosmos itself. This is where our story begins. The Sumerians called it the Ṭoop SheeMahTee, the tablet of Destinies, and across thousands of years of cuneiform writing, across hymns and battle epics and royal laments pressed into clay by dozens of different hands, it appears again and again with a consistency that is difficult to dismiss. Not as a metaphor, not as a poetic flourish, but as an object, a real, described, specific thing that the gods themselves fought over, stole from one another, and guarded with an urgency that suggests something far more than symbolic importance. Here's what's fascinating about the physical descriptions that survive. The tablet is not depicted as an enormous monument or a grand architectural feature. It is rendered as something closer to a cuneiform tablet of the kind scribes used every day. Pressed clay, wedge-shaped marks, the familiar material of Mesopotamian record-keeping. But the texts simultaneously suggest it came from a time before the Anunnaki themselves rose to prominence, before the divine hierarchy, as we know it, had been arranged, before the great gods had claimed their individual domains over sky, storm, and the deep waters beneath the earth. Some accounts even describe it as radiating, charged with a luminous quality that set it apart from every other object in existence. Whether that luminosity was understood as physical light or something the Sumerian scribes meant in a more metaphysical sense is genuinely difficult to say, because the language itself reaches towards something the writers seem to struggle to contain within any ordinary description. But in any case, it was not just a record, and that distinction matters more than it might seem at first. A record only describes what has already happened, what has already been thought. But the Ṭoop SheeMahTee did something far more active than that. Whoever held it held the legal and metaphysical authority to issue the Sheemtoo, the binding, unalterable fates that governed everything and everyone, from gods to kings, mortal civilizations, and even the very structure of the cosmos itself. Whatever was pressed into its surface did not merely describe reality, it became reality, the movement of stars, the outcomes of wars, the rise and fall of cities, the lifespan of individual human beings. All of it fell within the jurisdiction of whoever carried this object. It was, in the most literal sense the ancient texts could manage, a command console for the universe. And as fantastical as it may seem, that very same framing appears in one of the most dramatic episodes in Mesopotamian literature. The Anzu myth, preserved across multiple versions in both Sumerian and Akkadian, describes a great winged creature. Sometimes it is depicted as a lion-headed eagle who steals the tablet of Destinies directly from the god Enlil. The theft is catastrophic, not symbolically catastrophic, but structurally so. For the moment the tablet leaves Enlil's possession, the divine order begins to unravel. Decisions cannot be enforced. Commands lose their binding force. The machinery of the cosmos stalls and comes to a halt. The gods convene in panic. They need it back not because of pride, but because without it, the universe cannot function. That detail, repeated across different versions of the story, tells you something important about how the Sumerians understood this object. It was not symbolic authority. It was real. It was operational. And it was capable of reshaping every facet of the world we know. Enlil himself, the king of the gods in most of the oldest Sumerian sources, was described as the rightful keeper of the tablet once his pantheon had risen to power. And his authority over the other Anunnaki rested substantially on that custody. When he held it, his decrees were absolute. The stars obeyed him. The flood waters responded to his word. Other gods, including figures as powerful as Inanna and Enki, operated within limits that his possession of the tablet defined. It was the structural architecture behind the hierarchy. But while the tablet of Destinies governed the finite destinies, the turning of ages, and the vast structural decisions of the cosmos, the universe, it seems, also required something far more granular. A vast set of operational instructions to govern the everyday functions of human civilization and the divine order it had created. Because alongside that renowned relic of ancient power, there was something else, something that operated at a different level entirely, but was just as essential to keeping everything in balance. The Sumerians called it the Holy May. And if the Tablet of Destinies was the constitution of the cosmos, the May were its entire legal code, its engineering manuals, its cultural programs, and its societal contracts, all rolled up into one legendary source of wisdom. They were the divine decrees that governed every domain of existence: kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, the arts of metalworking and weaving, music, agriculture, writing itself, warfare, the rituals of mourning, the protocols of the temple. Each one of these things and hundreds more had a corresponding May, a governing principle that had been crystallized into a form that could be held, carried, and transferred. Here again, we see that the May were not simply abstract ideas. They were not philosophical principles floating somewhere in the divine imagination. The cuneiform sources describe them as very tangible, radiant, with a sort of energy that they couldn't quite capture in the written word. And unlike the Tablet of Destinies, where its possession always fell into the hands of a single supreme authority, the May was to be shared with all. And that last part is what makes them truly strange. Somehow it evolved into various objects, tablets, and artifacts, physical items that could be read and studied or utilized as talismans, objects that could be collected, locked away, stolen outright, or ceremonially bestowed from the heavens above, all of them reflecting the ultimate divine blueprints of the gods and the heavenly realm working in tandem with the underlying wisdom of the universe, to keep it steady, to keep it organized, to allow it to flourish and grow. This is just another example where the mythology becomes genuinely difficult to categorize, because it sits exactly on the edge between metaphor and something far more literal in the Sumerian mind. A god who possessed the May did not merely understand kingship in theory, they held the actual operative instrument of it, the living authority to make it real, to make it manifest on earthly planes. A design formed of the spiritual realms, to be reflected into the physical. And where did all this wisdom come from? While some sources point to a primordial titan of the earliest days of the universe, who ruled over the underground realm, most of the oldest sources point consistently to Enki, the wise god of the Apsu, the subterranean freshwater ocean that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth, a deep reservoir of hidden wisdom and primordial creative energy. Enki was the one who drew the May up from that source. He organized them, encoded them, and became their keeper, housing them in his underwater palace in the deep. But they were always there. He didn't invent the May so much as he located them within the primordial fabric of reality, giving them shape and form. Using his immense esoteric wisdom, he pulled them out of the cosmic ether and made them portable, made them usable, hundreds of them, covering the full range of what it meant to exist in an ordered world and a truly advanced society. And in those truths we find one of the clearest reflections of how the ancient Sumerians actually understood civilization. They did not see it as something humans had gradually built through trial and error. They did not see culture or agriculture or law or music as inventions of their own making. They saw all of it as pre-existing structure, a cosmic program that had been there since long before human civilization emerged, waiting to be brought into the physical world by way of a divine catalyst. The May themselves were the delivery mechanism, and from it, society didn't grow, it was installed. And then, when it was ready, when it was such a precisely calibrated system that it could be taught and studied, he sent it upward from his watery palace in the deep, carried by the Apkallu. Those enigmatic fish-cloaked sages who washed ashore in the muddy banks of Eridu, the first Sumerian settlement, and began teaching early humanity the disciplines of civilized life, sharing a vast wealth of knowledge that would be studied, copied, and preserved, passed down through centuries by kings and sacred priests and devoted scholars all across the cradle of early society. We may not be able to see the original May itself, but we can see what its teachings left behind, scattered throughout thousands of remnants of some of the earliest and most incredible ancient empires of all time. So were these two objects ever truly just metaphors? The Sumerians themselves didn't seem to think so. Each one was spoken of not as an abstraction, not as a symbol pointing towards something else, but as a real and tangible thing that existed, moved through the world, changed hands, and could be lost. A concept which brings you to the deeper implication underneath all of this, the profound implication of both the Holy May and the Tablet of Destinies, acting in unison to keep the balance of the ancient world. The realization that authority did not automatically belong to the gods themselves. It came from something higher than any of them. Something that was there all along, an underlying power beneath all things that had merely been manifested into tangible form, supreme power that was localized inside these artifacts themselves, making them capable of governing everything from time and the underlying driving energies of the universe to the seemingly smallest rules and rituals that kept it all in place, in balance. And in that world, a god was only legitimate if they held the divine physical instruments of cosmic law. When you hold the Tablet of Destinies and the May together in your mind at the same time, a very specific picture of the Mesopotamian universe emerges. It wasn't a matter of raw power. It was a matter of custody. A god who held the Tablet of Destinies controlled the structural arc of reality. A god who held the relevant May controlled the living operational functions of civilization and order. And a god who held neither, no matter how ancient or how mighty, was incomplete. Legitimate power in this system was largely localized inside these artifacts, fed through them. They were the instruments that carried the authority, and the gods were simply their current keepers. That is a profound way of looking at the past, of looking at the spiritual structure of ancient Sumerian belief. And it explains something about the intensity with which these objects were said to have been sought after, fought over, and sometimes even stolen. The Tablet of Destinies, for instance, appears throughout the ancient texts in the direct possession of whichever entity was pressing a claim to supreme authority at that time. That isn't the language of symbol. That is the language of something held, something worn, something that deserved to be fought over. And the battles and trickery that followed them was extraordinary. These two artifacts sit at the center of some of the most dramatic conflicts ever described in ancient Mesopotamian literature. Conflicts that stretch back before the Anunnaki themselves, into the deepest and most primordial layers of Sumerian cosmology. In the great creation epic known as the Enuma Elish, the primeval sea dragon Tiamat, one of the oldest forces in existence, places the Tablet of Destinies directly upon the chest of her general. The act was deliberate. It was a coronation of sorts. By fastening the tablet to him, she was declaring his right to rule the cosmos and lead her monstrous army against the Anunnaki. And when the young god Marduk defeated Kingu and claimed the tablet for himself, the entire meaning of that victory rested on that single object changing hands. Power wasn't simply taken. It was transferred through the artifact itself. Then, in a much later mythic cycle, the Anzu bird myth presents the tablet again, now kept by Enlil in his northern throne room, where it rested upon a high stone pillar. In a single moment of distraction, the great monstrous bird Anzu descends, stealing it away to the distant Zagros Mountains. What follows is immediate and total. Cosmic order freezes. The gods lose their authority. The universe falls into a kind of paralysis, because the instrument that carried divine function was simply gone. The hero Ninurta pursues Anzu across the sky, defeats him after a fierce and prolonged battle, and returns the tablet to Enlil's sanctuary. The order had been restored. Not because a god was restored to power, but because the object was. The Holy May had its own legendary history of transfer and dispute. One of the most famous is the myth of Inanna and Enki, sometimes called the Boat of Heaven. The goddess Inanna travels to Enki's palace at the edge of the deep waters in Eridu. They feast together, they drink, and in a moment of extraordinary generosity, Enki bestows upon her more than 100 of the sacred May. She loads them aboard the Ma'ana, the boat of heaven, and sails up the Euphrates toward her city of Uruk. And upon her arrival, Uruk quickly becomes something different. The city glows with cultural authority, political weight, and the living programs of civilization itself. Every craft, every office, every form of order that makes human society function had been physically transported from one seat of power to another. The May didn't just represent those things. They carried them. What the ancient scribes described was something that radiated, something that pulsed with a force larger than the object itself, a living energy that connected the physical form of the tablet or decree to a much deeper underlying order, one that holds all things in their proper place. And they appear again and again in texts separated by centuries, always as something pivotal, always as something that the cosmos could not properly function without. That kind of persistence across so many different accounts, across so many different hands and eras, points towards something the Sumerians understood at a very deep level about power, about custody and the structure of reality itself. And it doesn't end there. Once the sacred designs of the May and the Tablet of Destinies were theirs to behold, the gods required other precise physical and metaphysical instruments to measure their boundaries, and construct temples capable of housing them, tools of immense knowledge and sacred celestial geometry, tools needed to draw the lines of reality itself, to mark where order ended and chaos began, to survey the invisible boundaries that held the cosmos in its proper shape. And some among those tools had specific names: the Gesh-Hur, the measuring rod or stylus, and the Eshgana, the coiled rope or ring of the surveyor. And across thousands of years of visual Mesopotamian arts and written records, these two objects appear with a consistency that is striking once you begin to notice it. Not as the equipment of a craftsman, not as the practical instruments of a construction crew, but as the supreme emblems of cosmic authority, the visual shorthand across Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian culture alike, for the power to define space, set boundaries, and hold reality to a measurable standard. They appear in the hands of the highest gods in the pantheon: Anu, the Sky Father; Shamash, the sun god of law and light; Enki, the keeper of the deep waters and divine knowledge; Inanna, the goddess of love and war and queen of the heavens. When ancient artists wanted to show that a deity possessed ultimate authority, they placed these tools in the god's outstretched hand. And when kings received divine sanction to build temples, to govern cities, or to establish law on earth, the moment was depicted not as a handshake or a written document. It was often depicted as the transfer of a measuring rod and a coiled cord. That tells you something. The Sumerians, and those who came after them, believed that the power to measure was the power to rule, that governing a kingdom and surveying the cosmos were, at some fundamental level, the same act, and that that act was made possible via the utilization of highly specific instruments that may have had other functions far beyond our understanding. One of the most vivid examples of these tools appears in the myth of Inanna's descent into the underworld. Before the goddess crosses the threshold into that dark realm, she arms herself with 7 divine powers, and among them, held firmly in her hand, is the measuring rod and line, fashioned in spectacular form from deep blue lapis lazuli. That material matters enormously here. Lapis lazuli was the color of the night sky and the heavens. To the ancient mind, it carried the visual weight of celestial authority, of something belonging to a higher order than earth. So when Inanna holds a rod and line made from that stone, she is not carrying a simple tool. She is carrying visible proof that she possesses the power to define space, even within chaos. That is not a small detail. It's the entire point of the image. But perhaps the most famous surviving depiction of these tools in the whole of Mesopotamian art stands at the top of the Stele of Hammurabi, a basalt monument nearly 7 feet tall, carved around 1750 BCE. Most people know this stele for the legal code inscribed across its surface. Hundreds of laws governing commerce, property, injury, and family life, including the famous creed of eye for an eye. But the carving at the top deserves just as much attention, if not more. Shamash, the sun god, is seated and crowned with the horns of divine authority. Before him stands the king, and what Shamash holds out toward Hammurabi is not a scroll of laws. It is the measuring rod and the coiled ring, the instruments of measurement, not the text of legislation. To a modern eye, that seems like an odd choice, but to the Babylonian mind, it was the only logical one, because law, in their worldview, was not invented by a king or a council. It was measured against the perfect and unchanging standard of the universe itself. Justice was not an agreement between people. It was a mathematical relationship, as precise and as unyielding as the movement of stars above. To receive the rod and the line from Shamash was to receive the power to measure all of human conduct against cosmic truth, and that same logic runs through the cylinders of Gudea, a set of inscribed terracotta clay cylinders from around 2100 BCE that describe the building of a temple at Lagash. In a dream sequence, the scribal goddess Nisaba appears carrying a stylus of gleaming lapis lazuli and consulting a tablet of stars, while a companion deity holds the sacred measuring cord stretched outward. The gods are actively performing the art of celestial surveying. They are pulling measuring lines across the constellations before a single brick is laid on earth, ensuring that the temple foundation aligns with the heavenly vault above it. Earthly architecture in Gudea's understanding, and in the understanding of his most distant ancestors, was not a human invention at all. It was a copy of a divine blueprint, traced first across the sky. Meanwhile, the stele of Ur-Nammu, carved around the same time, shows a similar moment. The king stands before a seated deity, likely Nana, the moon god of Ur, who extends those same sacred emblements directly toward him. This was the sacred commission to build the great ziggurat of Ur, one of the most imposing structures the ancient world had ever produced. The transfer of those instruments meant that the massive terraced tower rising from the plain of Mesopotamia was not a monument to human ambition. It was a geometric expression of divine measurement, and its exact proportions. Every brick, every angle, every careful marker, they were not guessed, they were given, designed to perfection using the sacred tools of the gods. And what these tools represented across all these accounts is something beyond metaphor. In Mesopotamian thought, the Gesh-Hur was not only a physical object, but a set of invisible grid lines underlying reality itself, the geometric structure that separated ordered existence from the formless void that surrounded it. To hold the rod and the line was to hold the capacity to set the boundaries of kingdoms, to calculate the alignments between temples and stars, and to maintain a balance across the mortal world that was both ethical and physical and divine all at once. The tools did not describe order, they created it, they held its edges in place, and allowed it to become visible, definable, to establish perfect order where chaos would otherwise press in. Yet that measured world still required more, a permanent anchor, an axis of sorts, one that could bind the celestial realm above and the earthly realm below in a single unbroken structure, and hold them there, across time. And that anchor, like the divine instruments that likely helped to create it, also had a name. The ancient Sumerians called it the Dim Gal. Translated, it means something close to the great mooring post, or the cosmic stake. And alongside it existed a concept called the Duran key, which meant the bond of heaven and earth, or more literally, the rope that held the sky to the ground beneath it. These were not metaphors in the way we use that word today. They were understood as real forces embedded in the structure of existence itself, holding the known world in place against the pull of chaos. But to understand why this mattered so deeply, you have to take a closer look at how the Sumerians saw the universe around them. They lived surrounded by water. The great rivers of Mesopotamia flooded and shifted and changed course without warning. And in their cosmological imagination, the entire universe was itself a vast, dark sea of primordial waters, always moving, always pressing at the edges of ordered creation. The earth and the sky, everything that had been separated and given form, could theoretically drift, could slip back into the formless void that had preceded the gods and their work. And what kept that from happening, what held the cosmos anchored in position, was the Dimgal, an enormous, invisible mooring post, driven right through the center of existence by divine hands, lashing sky to earth the way a boat captain lashes a vessel to the dock, to keep it from being carried out to sea. And the city of Nippur was considered the place where that sacred stake entered the ground. Nippur, known in the ancient texts as Nibru, was the religious heart of ancient Sumer, and it belonged to Enlil, the lord of wind and atmosphere, the god who commanded the air between heaven and earth. At its center was his patron temple, known as the Ekur, meaning the mountain house, and it was praised in hymns as the Dimgal Kalama, the mooring post of the land. This was not poetic praise. The temple was understood to be the physical location where the invisible cosmic rope, the Dur, passed through the material world, where the upper heavens were lashed down to the earth below, through divine force that no human hand had woven, but that human ritual could tend to and sustain. Priests maintained Nippur not simply as a place of worship, but as a kind of celestial transmission point, a location where the bond between realms was kept strong, kept active, kept from fraying. The implications of the Dimgal extended outward from Nippur across every city-state in the Sumerian world, because if Nippur was the axis, then every settlement that acknowledged Enlil's authority was also connected to that axis. The movement of the planets was believed to be regulated through this alignment, the spiritual fate of cities, the rise and fall of kings, the granting or withdrawal of divine favor. All of this was understood to flow along the cosmic rope that Nippur held in place. Stability at the center meant stability everywhere. Disruption at Nippur meant the whole structure trembled. So once again we see the divine implementations of the gods being utilized and reflected upon the earth in ways we still can't fully explain. In this case, not in tools that can be held in any single person's hand, but in monuments, towering brick temples that can still be found in the city of Nippur, where the very real remnants of Enlil's mountain house can still be found. And it wasn't the only monumental structure that gods were said to have erected to organize the various realms of the universe, because while Enlil's northern sanctuary in Nippur anchored the high vault of heaven to the surface of the earth, his brother Enki maintained an equally powerful, sentient anchor deep within the primeval waters of the south. And Enki's sanctuary was something entirely different from anything Enlil had raised in the north. Where Enlil's great house at Nippur reached upward, anchoring the vault of heaven to the skin of the earth, Enki's domain pressed downward, deep into the water beneath everything, where the AyEngura, which translates roughly as the house of the subterranean waters, stood at the edge of the ancient primeval city of Eridu, the oldest city known to their world at the time. And at its heart, Enki built his house not simply on the soil, but into the Apsu itself, the infinite ocean of sweet freshwater that the Sumerians believed flowed beneath the crust of the earth, feeding springs and rivers and sustaining all life from below. The AyEngura did not sit atop this hidden ocean. It extended into it, rooted in it, drawing from it continuously, like a plant drawing water through unseen roots. And what the cuneiform texts describe about this structure is genuinely unusual, even by the standards of Sumerian mythology. In the epic known as Enki and the World Order, the AyEngura is not described the way we might describe any building. It's described as a living thing, a conscious entity. Its brickwork was said to speak. The palace walls themselves dispensed counsel and gave wisdom, as though the structure itself possessed something like a mind. The roof beam was fashioned in the image of the horns of the celestial bull of heaven, connecting the physical architecture directly to the greatest figures written across the sky. This was not decorative symbolism. In the Sumerian understanding, that connection made the building something more than any ordinary building ever could be. It made it a participant in the very ordering of the cosmos, and the reed fences surrounding the AyEngura shared in this animate quality. In texts like Enki's journey to Nippur, these fences are described as roaring and bellowing like wild bulls, vibrating with what the texts call a divine living energy, functioning almost as an acoustic barrier, projecting something terrifying and protective outward from the sanctuary's perimeter, pushing back chaotic forces that might otherwise disturb the peace of the underwater realm. But they carried another kind of power as well. The holy reeds were said to hold a liminal magic, a power that existed at the threshold between worlds. They were used for drawing sickness out of the body, for treating the dying, and for purifying objects that priests would later use in sacred incantations. The boundary between this world and whatever lay beyond it was thinner there along those reed banks than anywhere else in the known universe. Which brings us to the structural role the AyEngura played in holding the world together. The Sumerians called it the Ur-Nammu, meaning the great subterranean anchor. Where Enlil's northern sanctuary locked the high vault of heaven down to the surface of the earth from above, Enki's palace performed the opposite work from below, lashing the crust of the earth to the abyss beneath it, preventing the living world from drifting loose from its own foundations. Its position in the cosmic order placed it directly beneath the human realm and immediately above Ur, the dark and dusty underworld where all souls eventually came to rest. Gods and mortals alike passed into Ur when their time above ground had ended, and the AyEngura sat at the border of that silence, neither fully in the land of the living nor in the land of the dead, acting as a gateway between both. And sweet fresh water was pumped upward through that gateway, feeding the Tigris and the Euphrates, keeping the surface world alive. And those magical reeds, rooted in the waters of the Apsu, were believed to bridge the two realms together. Their roots reached down into the quiet of Ur, while their tips rose into the cool waters of the living world, connecting the depths to the surface, the dead to the living, and the silent darkness to the motion of light. As the speaking walls of the AyEngura hum with quiet wisdom, and the sweet waters of the Apsu lap gently against those ancient reed banks, the cosmic pillars rest securely. The anchors of heaven and earth hold everything together in perfect harmony, and the whole vast structure of the Sumerian universe breathes slowly, knowing everything is in its proper place. The great measuring lines are coiled gently beside their cedar posts. The sacred tablets lie still upon woven mats of river reed, their words no longer needing to be spoken aloud, for they have been preserved for all yet to come. The mooring posts hold firm in the dark earth, and the world they anchor sits in stability. There is nothing left to resolve, nothing left to carry. For everything there is to know has been with us all along, locked into permanence beneath our very feet, and hovering just overhead, all around us, all at once. And though the vast architecture of the Sumerian cosmos hums at a frequency too low for waking ears to catch, it is not too low for the mind that is beginning, slowly, to let go. So drift off slowly, not in the absence of structure, but the perfection of it. Every stone knows its place, every star knows its path. The cosmic machinery that the Sumerians understood so deeply continues to operate in this moment, even now, even here, with the same precision and care that was lavished upon it at the beginning of everything. Watch as twilight descends slowly over the marshlands of Eridu, settling in the way it always has, without announcement, without urgency, but with utmost certainty. The gold of the afternoon thins and softens. The sky above the river lagoons deepens from amber into something like violet, and then into a blue so dark and still it seems almost solid. The reed beds along the Euphrates bend slightly in the cool evening air, their tips tracing slow arcs across the surface of the water, before lifting again. The scent carried on that breeze is ancient, river silt, and the sweetness of date palms, cedar smoke curling upward from the quiet courtyards of temples, where oil lamps glow in silence, and the day's prayers have already been spoken. Hovering in the transition from day to night, that seems to suspend time itself, and here the threshold between one state and another becomes briefly visible, almost touchable, when that boundary between the seen and unseen grows thin. The priests have returned to their chambers to hear that same call, the ceremonial garments folded, and tucked away. And somewhere in the warm interior of a mud-brick house, a child of the old world is breathing slowly, having already gone somewhere deep and wordless. Generation after generation after generation, each one moving through the same soft corridor between waking and sleep, guided by the same stars, rocked by the same low current of the same old river. This is what time actually feels like from the inside, not like something passing, like something breathing. The rhythm of it enters the bones. The body learns it before the mind can even name it. And this synchronization with something vast and ancient is not something unattainable. It simply occurs as naturally as the river flows to the sea. The people of these ancient cities would go on to build things that still make the modern mind go quiet with wonder. They would press their strange wedge-shaped marks into clay and give the world its first written language, its first precisely calculated numbers. They would raise towering temples that seemed to lean toward the heavens. They would carry their knowledge outward, along trade routes stretching in every direction. And that knowledge would root itself in distant soils and flower into new forms across centuries. Civilizations would rise and change, and in some cases disappear beneath the slow accumulation of sediment and time. But the patterns they established, the observations they made about the sky, the stories they told about the gods who held the world in careful order, those did not disappear. They simply traveled forward before arriving here in this very moment. And as long as we keep asking these questions, keep searching through the remnants of lost civilizations to uncover the secrets of our past, they will remain. For even the gods themselves never truly receded into the background. They simply went quiet, the way that large ancient things tend to go quiet once their work is done. The Anunnaki became the silent sentinels of an unseen order. Their sacred instruments no longer held in visible hands, but still, by ancient understanding, doing their work somewhere just beyond the reach of ordinary sight. The primeval waters are slow and pure, and as sacred as they always were. The Apsu, that deep and quiet freshwater ocean beneath everything, moves at a pace that has no human word for it. Time in those depths is not minutes or hours. It's something older and more far patient than measurement itself. And somewhere in those dark and gentle currents, the great stories of creation are still being told, very quietly, to anyone whose mind has gone still enough to hear them. Because throughout all that time, humans have looked up at the same sky the gods had always occupied and listened, continuing to find meaning in it. The constellations rotating in their slow schedule, the moon following its reliable arc from one horizon to the next, the planets moving against the heavens above in patterns that patient observers could learn to anticipate. Nothing about the sky changed, nothing about that feeling of being small beneath it and somehow held by it changed either. There is something in that continuity that the mind, at this hour, tends to reach for without quite knowing why. The same stars that hung over Nippur in the deep of a Sumerian night hang overhead now, their light having travelled an almost incomprehensible distance to arrive in this exact moment and place in time. And we may have forgotten, but the universe has not. The anchors still hold. The order that those ancient minds tried so carefully to describe and preserve and honor is still operating, still breathing, still turning through its slow and enormous cycles with a patience that makes every passing thought feel very small and very temporary. So let your own thoughts begin to soften now. The questions that felt important at the start of the day have edges that are already blurring. Let them blur. Let them release the shape of the day and drift, the way that pollen drifts into still water, and slowly, without any effort at all, settles naturally to the bottom. Your body is heavy now in the best possible way, the kind of heavy that means something has released its hold. The breath moves in and out on its own, without you needing to remember it, without you needing to do anything at all. The violet sky above the old Mesopotamian marshlands has deepened into full night. The reeds are still. The lamps have gone dark, one by one, across the city. And the universe, ancient and unhurried, continues its rotation overhead, holding everything it has ever held, losing nothing, forgetting nothing, and carrying all of it forward through the long, murky depths of history.